We now proceed to the next panel, which is on China and the technology challenge. This topic really has come up in several panels already, including some yesterday. A few years ago, it may not even be on the agenda, but today it very much is on the agenda. And what we're going to talk about, I think, is that broader sort of set of technology challenges that have arisen between the United States and Europe on the one hand, and other democracies, including in Asia and China, particularly over the last few years, including over 5G. We'll be discussing whether some decoupling or diversification, as it's more increasingly called in Europe, in the technology sphere, may be appropriate, and how the US and Europe can work more closely together on new technologies like artificial intelligence and others, so not to fall into the trap maybe of 5G, whether there wasn't an effective alternative to Huawei. So to chair this panel, we're delighted to be joined by my colleague at Brookings, Lindsay Ford, who will moderate it. She is the David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program, and we have four terrific panelists. One small programming change: Roberto Viola, who is the Director General of the Communications Network Content and Technology at the European Commission, is unable to join us today because of a last-minute high-level meeting, and so we're very grateful for his deputy, Khalil Rouhana, who will join us to speak about this topic. The other three panelists are Bridge Colby, who is a principal at the Marathon Initiative and served in a senior position in the Pentagon earlier in the Trump administration; Alice Ekman, who is a senior analyst for Asia at the EU Institute for Security Studies; and Laura Rosenberger, who's a senior fellow and director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, Lindsay, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, Tom, so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are going to spend the next hour, as Tom said, talking about something that's become one of the hottest topics of debate, certainly here in the United States, I think in Europe as well, and that's China's technology capabilities and some of the challenges that its growing tech influence creates in the global system. It is a huge topic. There's a lot of ground to cover in a limited amount of time, but we have an all-star panel with us, so I want you to hear from them as much as possible. We're going to jump right into the discussion. Laura, if I can come to you first. You run an initiative at GMF right now called the Alliance for Securing Democracy, as Tom said, and I think you guys have really been on the front edge here in the United States in challenging policymakers to think about the threats that they're facing in the digital space and how they need to be dealing with what folks now refer to a lot of times as digital authoritarianism. You've written a lot on this topic, so I'm hoping you can sort of help frame the problem set for us. How exactly would you outline some of the key challenges that democracies like the US and in Europe are facing from China's tech influence right now?
Thanks so much, Lindsay. It's great to see you and others on screen. And thanks so much for inviting me to join you today. As Tom noted, this is a huge topic. So I'm going to try and take sort of one piece of the elephant, if you will, and try to frame out this conversation in terms of the tech challenge that we face from China, particularly vis-a-vis democracy. And a couple of sort of points that I want to make up front. The first is that I think sometimes we tend to think about technology as its own separate space or its own separate domain for competition with China. And I think that's a really misnomer and a fundamental misunderstanding of what, in fact, we're dealing with. Technology today undergirds everything. And I think that's never been more clear than in the digital world that we are all basically working from now, living virtually in the face of the pandemic. It's really underscored to us the way in which digital technology is so fundamental to every aspect of our lives. But I think it's really important to understand that, we have all this conversation around technology. Is it neutral? Is it not? Does it help democracy? Does it face autocracy? But the reality is that both who's designing the technology and how that technology is being applied and deployed absolutely carries values with it. these technologies are shaping our fundamental realities. They're shaping the information that we get. They're shaping the way that algorithms prioritize things now when we're going shopping online. They help us think through what comes up first on our Instacart lists here in the US. I don't know what the Instacart parallel is in Europe. But our lives are being fundamentally ordered by technology. And I deeply believe that across multiple different kinds of technologies, it really matters what sort of values are influencing the trajectory of that development. So that's big point number one. Big point number two is that there's real asymmetries in this space. And we could talk about those on a couple of different dimensions. But the biggest one I want to point to here, because I think it's relevant for how we think about this challenge and how democracies need to kind of think about it as well, is an asymmetry in the economics behind the technological development. So on the one hand, in China, obviously you have a state capitalist system where not only is the party and the state taking a pretty assertive role in investing in and guiding the development of particular technologies. But of course, on top of that, for those who are familiar with the Chinese Communist Party structure, in most instances, if not all, really, I would argue, in companies engaging outside of China, you have party offices or party cells that are located within all of these companies to help direct and guide their thinking. And that's, juxtaposed against a free market system where, in the US, in our technology development, in Europe, in most instances, there's a much more hands-off approach. And the idea has been that innovation in the free market should guide technologies. But when it comes to some of these big strategic technologies that are fundamentally reordering the world in which we live, particularly around artificial intelligence, but you could even talk about things like quantum computing, biotechnology, CRISPR, which is gene editing, there's a really important dimension to government investment in helping to shape strategic technologies that aren't necessarily ones that are guided by profit. And that's sort of where we see the development happening in the US. So those are two really big framing points. Let me just run through a couple of really specific things just to kind of put a little bit of meat on the bones in terms of what we're actually talking about tangibly. In the digital space where you highlighted, Lindsay, digital authoritarianism, I talk about it as techno-authoritarianism. I think we often tend to think about this in narrow ways, but I've argued that there's three dimensions to this competition. It's occurring across not only the information and data dimension, but the infrastructure that's underpinning digital technology. So 5G is obviously the most discussed here, and we can come back to that, but there's other aspects. And then the governance of it, where we've seen Beijing be particularly active in places like the UN, but also in standard setting bodies to help frame out how these technologies are governed. And obviously values go along with those governance frameworks. But I think in terms of a couple of other specific things that we should just think about today, in addition to 5G infrastructure, there's things like safe cities, which Huawei and ZTE have been particularly active in exporting, that basically create these surveillance systems within other countries. And lest our European friends think they're immune, or the US, these technologies have found their ways into a number of European cities. We're having debates over how to handle Chinese indigenous social media platforms like TikTok and WeChat. And WeChat, we know from research that the government is able to access data on WeChat users outside of China. And China's thinking about, or in the process of developing, a new internet protocol that would provide government more access, and a separate root server that would essentially allow China to control internet traffic. So I know that's kind of a lot to throw on the table, but I just wanted to lay out the breadth of things. And I'll just sort of wrap this opening frame with two quick points. The first is that we're seeing the dimensions of, how technology is core to this battle between democracy and autocracy playing out in great detail, really unfortunate detail, in Hong Kong right now. What the PRC is doing to extend the reach of its frameworks around data, technology, information into Hong Kong super rapidly just underscore the importance of this space for democracies. And the second point is essentially what Tom hit on in his opening comment was, we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about how to counter these technologies, how to counter techno-authoritarianism, how to counter Chinese technologies. We need to be thinking about our own competitive offer. What are we bringing to the table? What does a democratic, technological universe look like? And how do we actually advance that? And how do we do that together? And I think that's the piece of the conversation that's been really missing to date and is urgently needed.
Thanks, Laura. Fantastic points. I definitely want to come back to you on that last point as we get a little further into the conversation. Alice, I want to turn to you though for a second. When Laura was talking, she mentioned, that one of the things we have to be thinking about is how these technologies are applied and who's using them matters. And she raised the topic of smart cities, safe cities. This is something you've written about. Because some of these technologies are in Europe too. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you see different European capitals handling the question of Chinese digital infrastructure, adoption of some of these safe cities agreements and platforms, and some of the risks you see there.
Sure, Lindsay. First of all, I want to start by saying that Europe is not naive. It's been many years now that we've been brainstorming and thinking about the threat posed by China's digital initiatives, but also in general term related to China's investment, including in strategic sector, but also in the tech sector. You're aware of the screening mechanism for foreign direct investment. You're aware of the policy discussion here in Europe. So I really want to emphasize this point. Europe is not naive. Usually this observation is made by people who are not aware of the policy discussion in Brussels, or who are not aware of latest decision made by EU member states. But yeah, to go back to your point, I really would like to emphasize that we should not underestimate China's tech ambitions and ability to reach these ambitions. Because for a long time, both in Brussels and Washington, we were considering that China is not able to innovate, or that China, due to the political system, will always lag behind in terms of research and development, etc. Recent development on 5G has proven the contrary, but not only on 5G, on drones, on video surveillance cameras, on data gathering and analysis, we have seen that China is very competitive, has very competitive companies, and that should be acknowledged for the sake of analysis, but also for the sake of policy making. This ambition, China's tech ambition, date back from Hu Jintao, but has accelerated under Xi Jinping, who is, and I'm quoting here, he is explicitly talking about building, and let me search the exact quote because this is important. He's saying that China always needs to develop along with social realities and technologies of the time, and is looking to develop a modern form of Marxism, an adaptive form of Marxism that is aligned with latest technological development. And this push has been reinforced in recent years. We have seen China's investment, for example, in blockchain technologies, in trying also to restructure the norms and standards and the approach toward blockchain in a way that the party can better supervise this infrastructure. But in more general term, we have seen China really investing in what is called safe or smart city technologies. Laura mentioned that. Lindsay, also you referred to this. It is very important because smart city is encompassing a diversity of technologies, and 5G is core to the development of smart cities. So now we are focusing on 5G, and this is understandable, but there is also a lot of other tech components in an urban environment that China has a competitive edge in, and that should be taken into consideration. And my point here is that COVID-19 has not led to a downgrading of China's tech ambitions in the field and ability to reach this ambition again. Because, for instance, if you look at smart city at time of COVID, China has used existing infrastructures, tech infrastructure, and tried to test them or improve them in the pandemic context. This applied to AI thermal cameras, also the use of drones, the use of robots. Of course, that was not even on the Chinese territory, but what is interesting is that China highly communicated through state media on this development, but also Chinese government and Chinese tech companies donated some of these products and services to foreign countries and first and foremost to developing countries. Europe is not the top target of China's tech services and products. It is one of the targets, but the top target are developing countries. For instance, to give you just two examples to be concrete, video conference equipment from Huawei have been given to Pakistan, to Kenya, to the government of these countries. Then AI thermal cameras from Dahua have been donated to the government of Lebanon. And drones have been also donated to diversity of local government, including in the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries. These are just examples. But to say that we are seeing here, I think we from Brussels, Washington, we have a convergence of analysis about the tech challenges that China is posing. But you have a diversity of perception in the world, and you have, let's say, a group of countries, including from sub-Saharan Africa, who are seeing China's tech donation services product in a much positive lens, from a much positive lens that we are seeing. So what I'm saying here, and that will be my last point, is that in my opinion, tech decoupling is already taking place. Not just because of the tech tension observed between Washington and Beijing over the last 2 years, not because only of the entity list and China reaction and retaliation in front of this entity list released by US administration, but also because you have now countries positioning themselves in front of China's offer. Some more and more rejecting this offer based on security concern. And this includes an increasing number of EU member states who are concerned about China's 5G network provided by Huawei in particular, but other countries who are really enthusiastic about China's tech offer. And I'm mainly here thinking about countries outside Europe, so I want to nuance really the perception here. But this diversity of perception should be taken into account because China is not alone technologically, and even if there is growing transatlantic convergence on China's tech challenge, I believe that we will observe increasingly a diversity of services and products provided by China, but also a diversity of norms, and also a rapprochement between China and Russia on tech issues that we should not underestimate. We could develop a lot about China-Russia cooperation, but I would stop here to say that for me, technological decoupling is just at the first stage. It's emerging, and I'm expecting further consolidation independently of transatlantic convergence on the issue, which is also emerging in a significant way.
Great, thanks, Alice. So you've walked us into what is obviously a really hot topic on the subject of tech right now, and this is the idea of decoupling. And Bridge, if I can come over to you for a second, because I think Alice is right. Certainly that the debate at this point is not really over whether or not decoupling is happening or should happen. It is. The question now, I think, and this debate is playing out domestically in the United States between different constituencies, but also I think between the US and Europe, where there may be some differences of opinion, is sort of how far and how fast, how wide does this decoupling proceed? So can you talk me through, I guess, how you sort of see the state of that debate here in the United States, and in particular, in your experience at the Pentagon, maybe where you see some of the points of tension between where the national security community is on this question and perhaps the technology sector and businesses themselves.
Sure. Well, thanks, Lindsay, and fascinating comments from the previous panelists, and great to be on the panel with them. I mean, just to be kind of telegraphic, I mean, I think the decoupling debate, there's a bit of a straw manning out there, not certainly by you, but sometimes about a kind of a pursuit of complete decoupling. And I think really what we're likely to move towards our sort of criterion is to diminish China's coercive leverage, and that's going to vary across different countries. But I think what Alice just said tracks, sort of my intuition or my instinct. But it's gratifying and refreshing to hear that, because I think that indicates that Europe's own assessment of the dangers of excessive integration with China are going to be are also significant as well. I mean, I think Aaron Friedberg, I think led a project that National Bureau of Asian Research did recently on what decoupling might look like. I think we don't know exactly what the specifics are going to be, but I think where there are these, and I think Laura touched on them eloquently, these enormous vulnerabilities, the contours and extent of which we don't fully appreciate yet, but which are clearly very significant and get to the most intimate aspects of our lives, and therefore are rife for opportunities for coercion. I think we're going to have to play it cautious on these issues, of course, like 5G, but also social media, all kinds of the technology, the sort of commanding heights of the technological environment, and of course that also applies in the military sphere to defense and defense relevant technologies. I mean, I think we sort of all know where this is going to have to go. We're sort of struggling to get there for various reasons, but I think we're going to have to together create market scale across the Atlantic, but just as, if not more importantly, also with markets like Japan, Australia, India, et cetera, that are able to compete with the size of the Chinese market. I mean, my understanding, and I'm not an expert on AI, but my understanding is that at least at this phase in technological development, you really want, quantity of data is a major issue. And of course, the Chinese have well over 1 billion people. That may not be true in the future, but I think that it's sort of a useful example of the fact that you need market scale. Now, Americans have problems with how Europe treats American technology companies and other issues. Europeans have problems with how we treat, aspects of your companies and market issues. So, I mean, I think the fundamental reality, though, is that we're going to increasingly have to see those debates within the broader context of the fundamental priority of the China challenge in both of our geopolitical assessments, certainly in the United States, but I think in Europe as well. And I think, Tom's point at the beginning, which is that this would have been maybe not even mentioned a couple of years ago, but is now sort of the defining feature of this conversation, in a sense, I think is the most persuasive aspect of it at all, that it's not a kind of a debated point, but that we all need to grapple with this. And then we're going to need to put this into the, and in the defense context, I mean, I think, this is where one of the areas where I think a more robust sort of profile or avenue for Europe and even the European Union, certainly not in contravention to NATO, but in concert and compatible with NATO, for defense industry, for the opportunity to sell, obviously, to their own market and militaries, but even ultimately to the U.S. market would be something that we should be willing to encourage, because we can't at the same time insist only on buying American all the time. Now, it's easy for me to say. I'm not accountable to workers in a factory in a congressional district, but I think that's where, on the defense side, we're going to have to make sure that we have the degree of security assurance and that sort of thing. But ultimately, we want Europe to have its own ability to contribute, again, that scale just in the defense space as much. And if we can buy an anti-ship cruise missile that, say, a Norwegian company makes, well, we should be able to do that, especially given that we're going to have, we're going to have much less margin in competing with a very, very sophisticated and growing PLA.
Thanks, Bridge. Your point, I think, built on what I'm hearing from Alice as well as Laura, which is that, we really need to be thinking perhaps not as much about decoupling all the time, but this idea of recoupling. How do we actually begin thinking about coordinating more effectively as allies and as democracies? And Laura, this comes back to what you said at the beginning about the point that essentially we've been on defense a lot, and we need to think about how we more proactively go on offense, ideally in a combined way as allies. So you've put ideas out there, in particular for dealing with some of the challenges of disinformation in a more proactive way between allies. Can you sort of walk through, I guess, some of your thoughts on what a more proactive combined alliance strategy might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually relates, I think, to some of the points that Bridge was just making too on AI and data. So let me kind of walk through a couple of points there. I mean, I should also just sort of put my cards on the table in terms of my bias on this, which is that particularly when it comes to to some of the social media space and the sort of information technology aspects of the internet world, if you will. I believe that right now the model that the U.S. has to offer, which is surveillance capitalism, is fundamentally putting us at a disadvantage in a competitive environment with China. Alice is exactly right that a lot of the technologies that China's marketing is aimed at more developing parts of the world. And in so many of those spaces, I've had conversation upon conversation with whether it's civil society actors or government actors who simply don't really see a difference between Chinese technologies with significant government insight into data and US technologies with significant unaccountable private sector companies profiting off of data. And while I have a view on a distinction there, the bottom line is we are losing if what we are offering is profit off of data, if our data is what is driving and for sale. And so I think that a core of what we have to do to make a more competitive offer and to develop a model that is much more attractive. Number one is be much more robust in how we think about data. And this comes in a couple of different ways. I mean, one, obviously, Europe has really led with GDPR and is far ahead of the United States in thinking about data protection. But that's only one aspect of the challenge. The US needs to catch up there, but then we need to think more broadly about how do we ensure that data is able to be used for these critical technologies like AI that Bridge noted, where data is absolutely central, but done in a way that protects people's privacy and that doesn't make us the thing that's up for profit, right? That's point one. And I could go into a whole long riff on how, the data infrastructure and ad tech is actually core to why disinformation goes so viral. If we were to short circuit some of those abilities to use data to drive, how we are driving engagement on platforms toward virality and all that, we would be able to rewire things so that some of that disinformation would not be quite as pernicious in its effect. So the data piece of it is core. There are some interesting ideas that other colleagues have put out there. I'll just cite one, which is to create almost a Schengen zone, an Internet Freedom League. This is Dick Clark and Rob Kanaki have proposed this, essentially an area of democracies that join together on certain principles to say, data flows freely within our borders under these principles and with these values. Now, I have some concerns about that approach in the sense that I think it will leave a lot of the developing world out of our Freedom League. And that they won't be able to meet the standards, and that means in a bifurcated internet future, China's going to get more of the world than we will, which for a whole lot of reasons is probably not where we want to end up. But the reality is, I think we need to be having those conversations, and the US and Europe need to be talking about data governance in addition to data protection and data privacy in a much more robust and alliance way. The other thing I'll just note, name checking another colleague's work here, Andrew Imbrie at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology has written about AI and alliances and ways we can do much more pooled data sharing and other ways of actually bringing together and leveraging one another in this space. So I think that's one really, really big point. The data piece of this is core. I think oftentimes we look at these technologies sort of from the endpoint rather than thinking backing it up and how can we actually collaborate and cooperate more on the sort of leading edge piece where I think we actually can do a little bit more together. So I'll pause there in the interest of time.
Great, thanks, Laura. So on this question of data governance, Alice, I'd like to just come back to you because obviously the US and Europe may have some different perspectives on this thus far, which if we're going to get to a place of greater alliance coordination, we have to begin to close the gaps on. I'm curious if you have some thoughts on how do we actually begin to do that in a practical way? How do we move towards something that looks more closely aligned than where we are now?
Thanks for this question, Lindsay. I fully agree with what Laura just said about governance of data, or data governance versus data protection. It's important to protect data, but it's also important to invest in the field of data governance, but also to invest in a field that scares us as democracies, which is the surveillance dimension of tech. You know, we talked about smart, safe cities earlier. In Europe, there is this question about, including during the pandemic crisis, you know, to use or not to use surveillance, you know, thermal camera, AI surveillance, facial recognition, all this, you know, for example, French regulation does not allow it, etc., and probably for good reason, with data, due to data protection, personal, you know, freedom, etc. But if we don't invest the field that scares us, means the security, that dark, so-called dark dimension of tech, this will be left to countries which will shape these technologies according to their own political system, and will export these technologies to other political systems, and step by step shape you know, technology infrastructure and urban infrastructure that is not in line with our values, principle, etc. So what I would suggest is that instead of putting on the side, you know, the element of tech use that scares us, we should fully embrace that. For example, I think we should fully invest in safe city, not in, you know, not necessarily in a way to that is running counter to our democratic system, but on the contrary, to safeguard democracy, we need to invest in the field so that we can shape norms, standards, but also use of these technologies that are in line with our political system, and also that can be competitive abroad, including towards countries which are not so-called like-minded, because there is a lot of, you know, discussion about coalition among like-minded countries on technologies, etc. Sure, but the competition is also elsewhere, and I think this should be very taken into account, because if we don't invest in the surveillance and security dimension of technologies, step by step, our cities, our countries will also might lead towards a form of. I mean, they might be just backward in terms of because fully investing in technologies in urban environment is also good for the economy, is also good for security of the territory that is concerned, etc. I won't go too far, but I think there is it is not black and white. It's not okay. This is a scary type of technology that we should be careful of, and this is something that we should have a different look at some of the technologies that are developed in countries, so that we can channel these technologies in a way that is compatible with our political system. A second point I wanted to make is ecosystem, or let's say platform. I mean, earlier we talked about building alliance, and there is several initiatives, including transatlantic one in that direction, but also between the US and Japan. But China on its side now is building conglomerates of tech companies that are working together to provide package to local governments in China, but also to local governments abroad, in a way that that basically they have an infrastructure that is fully compatible with technologies that are working in a comprehensive way. I'm thinking, for instance, to give an example about the PASS package, which is China's smart city architecture in cooperation with Ping An, which is a famous insurance company in China, Alibaba, which is an e-commerce company, Tencent that you know, and Huawei. These companies are working together to build a safe smart city package, right? So if we don't take into consideration the ecosystem or the comprehensive dimension of technologies, we build component and not making sure that these are compatible, we will not be competitive anyway, and it's already starting to be the case. So building an ecosystem of technologies, partly independently of the nationality, it can be from US, from Europe, from other countries who may share same vision of this type of technologies use, etc., and same interest. A last point I wanted to make, which is indirectly related to your question, but I still want to make it, is that now we are witnessing an indirect but strong relation between geostrategic and geopolitical issue and technology. To give you an example, India just banned 59 Chinese apps, partly in relation with tension regarding the border. And this will continue. Hong Kong situation, possible development in Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, all this are leading to diplomatic tensions between countries, including between European countries and China. that leads to retaliation potentially on both sides. At least from a European perspective, I can assure you that perception on tech challenge, China's tech challenge, is also related to perception of China geostrategic challenge at large. And so we should anticipate also the evolution based on geopolitical tension and geostrategic tension. Now that there is no time and no place to divide with strong ceilings between technology, maritime issue, security issue in a strict sense, economics. All this is more and more interrelated, and at least that's the case from a Brussels perspective.
That's great points, Alice. Bridge, I think I want to come to you. I think we've got time for about one more question before we go to some Q&A from participants. But picking up on Alice's point about if we actually want to be competitive, we need to think about how we sort of lean in together, including with our companies. And you mentioned before in the defense space that there's potentially a lot of opportunity for alliance coordination, which I fully agree with. One of the challenges here, obviously, is everyone has their own defense industries. So what do you do to actually create, I guess, more of an alliance ecosystem as we start thinking about innovation in the defense space?
Great. Well, thanks. Actually, I think maybe I'll answer your question, but a little bit broader, more stepping back in a second. And I thought both the comments just now were really interesting. And I was expecting to disagree a lot more with what Laura said. I ended up agreeing with a surprising amount of it. But I do want to, maybe I'll, just for the sake of being controversial, I do want to pour cold water on the idea that we should set a high threshold for the degree of transatlantic coordination and collaboration on some of these tech issues, and particularly dealing with privacy, the shape of the internet. I mean, this is a point I make regularly. I try to make regularly in the transatlantic context, is that I think we talk a little bit too much about values and the fact that we're all democracies. I mean, ultimately, the world is becoming, this is the sort of great power competition thing, and there's a debate about how much that is shaped by ideology. I think fundamentally it's a structural issue. And I think on point is that Americans and Europeans disagree about a lot of issues relating to those values and what exactly, once we get beyond issues of democracy and human rights and these kinds of basic things. And frankly, Americans disagree with each other. I mean, I think the question, I mean, I was sort of encouraged to hear Laura talk with some skepticism about correct me if I'm mischaracterizing you, but as I understood it, the big tech companies and what they might do with your data. I think that's very valid. And I think there's a wide swath of the American public that would agree with that today. And I think there's probably true in Europe as well. So I think we should have a kind of a fairly low bar for what we're trying to achieve in terms of the content that goes into this kind of the political side, if you will, of this technology. I mean, I would prioritize things like free speech. I mean, I know Laura is super concerned about the disinformation issue. I think disinformation is an issue. I'm more concerned about free speech. Now, that's an issue that we're not going to resolve here, but I think it's important in the transatlantic context that we not just kind of cover that up. Not that you were trying to, but just to kind of surface that debate, because I think if we think about it, and sometimes I think that the transatlantic conversation sort of isn't as candid and fronting about these debates in practical terms as it should be. On the defense industry side, I mean, I think this is a tough issue, but I mean, look, I mean, I basically look at it as the PRC economy is going to continue growing. They're only dedicating roughly probably about 2% of their GDP to defense, so they're actually considerably below the United States. And say what you will about Xi Jinping, I'm sure he'd be willing to go higher. I mean, he's willing to pick a fight with India. So, we're going to have to prioritize. My view, I think we're going to have to prioritize heavily on China, and that'll be an interesting thing. I was interested in what Vice President Biden was talking about. Talking a lot about Russia the other day, and I think this will be an interesting thing going forward. My view is that Europe should focus more on European security, and particularly NATO should focus on the territorial integrity of the European North Atlantic area, particularly Europe. And then maybe the EU and others can focus more on, to some extent, that, but also the Near East, Mediterranean, and North Africa. And the United States then would be able to cap and ultimately, over time, reduce its actual, not its sort of political commitment and its willingness to come to the aid Europe in its defense, but it's kind of a concrete dollars and cents and numbers of troops commitment would go down. And I think this is where there's a potential for a concord with President Macron's vision of a more vigorous Europe and to some extent a more autonomous Europe. If autonomy means not doing what the US is and creating a third pole, I don't think that's going to fly. But if it's in the context of a broader alignment of this sort of more minimalist nature, then I think there's a lot to talk about. And then the US should be willing to give on issues like buying European defense equipment. That would seem like a pretty clear way that we could have some trade space with Europe to say, okay, we're going to do less in the European context. I don't think Europe can make much of a difference from a military perspective in the Pacific. So if you kind of take a lead here, well, obviously American military buying its own European stuff is one thing, but there are many other aspects of regulation and information sharing and technology sharing that I think, it seems to me from a strategic perspective, we would benefit with a more liberal kind of perspective towards Europe. But again, I'm not representing a congressional district, so the fact that I say it's probably not that meaningful. Hey, Lindsay, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. So thank you, Bridge. And we've just actually been joined by our final panelist. So I think what we're actually going to do here is, unfortunately, I want to make sure he has a chance to talk. So we may have to skip the Q&A session. And I think we're going to do probably a little swap, because I know we will unfortunately lose Laura Rosenberger shortly. But we have Khalil Rouhana with us now. And so I want to give him a chance to offer some remarks. Khalil, we have covered an amazing array of topics over the course of this panel, ranging from data governance and privacy to AI to defense cooperation. So I just want to give you, I guess, an opportunity now, if you'd like to weigh in with some of your own perspectives, in particular on how Europe is thinking about managing the China tech challenge and some of the key debates you think are happening and that you are participating in that will continue to unfold in the coming months. Perhaps we have lost Mr. Rouhana. Okay, unfortunately, we will just move forward then. So we have one question that I will throw to, we have one question I will throw to our panelists right now. And that is, what should be the West's approach towards China's deployment of tech in developing countries, and how will that play into the current geopolitical issues in those regions? Laura, I know you have to pop off, so why don't I give you a minute or two to say something, and then Allison Bridge, I'm happy to come over to you.
Great, thanks, and apologies that I do have to drop early. This has been a really rich discussion, so I'm super happy to have been able to make this work. But I think this is a great question, and there's so many things I could say in response to this, but I'll just focus on the one big one in my mind, which is the U.S. And our democratic allies, U.S. and Europe in particular, both, I think, really need to be present. U.S. retreat from the world that we've really seen over the past few years has created significant vacuums that China has been able to take advantage of. And even before that time, these are not parts of the world that the U.S. was necessarily prioritizing. China's different approach to economic investment as opposed to U.S. economic aid, China's, at least on the surface, pretends to attach less strings. We all know that it comes with much more coercive and different sorts of strings later on. But that is an attractive thing, I think, to a lot of developing parts of the world. But the U.S. needs to be present, and Europe needs to be present. And I'll make sort of two specific points on this. One is, Alice's point, really important point on the ecosystem and focusing on all these different technologies and how they interact, all these different companies and how they're interacting. I firmly agree with that, particularly again in the developing country space. And I would layer on top of that these technologies also generally are not exported just as technologies. They come with training packages. They come with, personnel from China that, they come and operate things. There's often data feeds back to China. Sometimes personnel is taken to China from different countries, and Chinese officials often help countries write laws that are more favorable to these kinds of digital authoritarian technologies, and they end up being laws that look a whole lot like China's. So we need to understand this full scope of how these technologies are exported and are deployed to other countries, and be much more present and involved in building capacity, in having all sorts of exchanges. And in the European context, I would just note, there's been some really interesting thinking that's being done. And I agree with Alice, Europe is certainly not naive to these challenges in any way. We do have some different approaches, but Europe has been doing a lot of thinking, particularly President Macron and his government, as well as the new EU leadership, is doing a lot of thinking about what Macron has called sort of a third way for Europe in the digital space, right? And he's talked about having something that is, a sovereignty approach that is distinct from China's sort of overreaching government internet and the U.S. sort of private sector internet. And, President von der Leyen has said similar things about technological sovereignty. And so I think, Europe's doing some interesting thinking there. My only comment on that would be, I hope to see it have ambitions beyond just Europe. It's thinking about European digital space alone. And if we are going to actually be competitive in this contest with China in the technological space, I think we need to be thinking about a democratic space and doing that together. So I hope that thinking can build to something beyond just Europe's borders. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Laura. Really appreciate that. It looks like we now have Mr. Rouhana with us. So I will actually pop over to him now. We are discussing the question of how to deal with the export of Chinese technology to developing countries and the potential impact that will have. But as I realize you're just joining us, Mr. Rouhana, if you would like to take a minute and just offer some broader remarks in your thoughts on how Europe is approaching the China Tech Challenge and some of the regulatory issues that countries, national governments, and the European Commission are working through. We'd welcome that from you.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the hiccups in the connection. It's the technology stuff. Thank you very much. I had the opportunity to listen to Elbridge, in fact, part of Alice's speech, but I could not speak. So in fact, what we consider as important for the digital transformation of our economy and society. So technology, it's not here for technology, it's because it has impact on our lives, as we know, and on our economy. The way we see it is a digital transformation that safeguards, and sorry for Elbridge, I don't think he mentioned that we're overdoing on this. In fact, we're not. So it's a digital transformation that respects our values, indeed, i.e. our democratic processes, i.e. our fundamental rights, but also that help us develop a society and economy that correspond to our other policy priorities, like the Green Deal, like our environmental challenges, our climate challenges. So we see digital transformation as a key part of the development of our societies and economies for the future, indeed. And therefore, it is important for us to have a legal framework that enables us to do this. And there is a fundamental way, approach to the way we approach legal issues and legal frameworks that sometimes gives, I would say, two paths for the same objectives between us and the US, which is, the ex ante vs ex post type of approach to law. And we, in Europe, we have an ex ante established tradition in terms of legal frameworks. And that explains, the legislation we put in place. But also because we have citizens that are key, that for them, a digital transformation cannot be hazardous. A digital transformation has to respect what their what the acquis of the European democracies in terms of fundamental rights, in terms of respect of privacy, of personal information, etc. And I think on the whole, the way we approach the society, of course, the same. We have very similar approaches to the development of our societies and economies in the liberal way with the US. It's just that sometimes we take different paths, but ultimately, I think the goal is the same. But these different paths can create tensions, and we try to explain and engage in dialogues with the US at different levels, with the government, of course, from the EU public side, but also with the private actors, because Europe is open, and a large part of our digital activity in Europe is done with American-based companies and US-based companies, and they're welcome to operate in Europe. So we have this dialogue with industry, we have a dialogue with civil society, we have this dialogue with governments. I think lately we've been doing less of that, and we need to do more, I would say, in the future. I think that's important. But we know as well that we will not be able to have a digital transformation that is in line with our aspirations if we don't master the technology, if we don't have a strong industrial base in this area, if we're not able to attract investments into Europe. So we're very careful with that as well, make sure that we have a framework that still favors investments in Europe, favors business development in Europe, favors favorable to attract talents in Europe, the best talents in this area. We have a lot of effort to do in this area, and this is our engagement. Digital transformation and the climate, addressing the climate challenge, are the two biggest priorities for the Union today, and we saw it in the recovery package. We act on the legislation side to create a balanced framework that create a trust in the digital transformation, and we think it's essential. We think it is essential. It is what Europe likes. This is the trademark of Europe, and I hope it's a trademark that we use also with our like-minded economies, the US, Japan. The trust is extremely important, and we know it. Trustful development. So that's a legal framework that also creates stability for industry to invest, for investments. We're working on the legal side. We're working also on the investment side, and we propose major investments to be done in Europe in partnership with the private sector. And we said it's welcome. Anyone who would like to come and invest in Europe, follow the way and help us contribute to the development of the digital transformation across the world, in line in the way we see it and the way we think it should develop, together with our like-minded economies, they're more than welcome. It's the way we see it. And we're engaged. We're not doing this against anyone. We understand the specificities of every region, and we don't want to preach to anyone. We just have a way of addressing it that is in line with what our citizens think. And then we show the way, and we think it's the right way. And we invite our trading partners around the world, including China, to see what we do and see how it fits with what they do. We're not naive. I mean, I think it's very clear we're not naive either, and we're not addressing it with naivety. We're looking for fair competition, for a level playing field all across the world. We know how the importance of digital technologies on security, on defense. They're essential. It's a core technology, and we're not going to let it go for Europe. It's important that we maintain our presence in this area, and we're committed to that. And we're committed also to make sure that we are engaging with our partners on similar grounds. We repeat it to all our partners around the world. We repeat it to our Chinese, to the Chinese governments. Indeed, we highlighted laws in China that might not be in line with what we think is a fair competition, what we think is a way to address personal data, etc. So we engage in the digital and the tech development of the future, and in particular digital technologies, in a way that is in line with what Europe does. What does? It's based on stable legal frameworks, transparency, democracy. It's based also our willingness to make sure that we contribute with a very dynamic innovation ecosystem, that we have a strong industrial base so that our contribution is meaningful. I don't think we will be able to have the digital transformation that we want if we don't have a solid basis, and we'd like to develop with our partners. I think EU and US have a lot in common, and if we look at the investments, cross-Atlantic investments, where they're still the highest, and we would like that to continue. And I think there is room for improving in terms of explaining how we do things for the future.
Thank you so much. Well, I know there is a full program today, so I think I need to turn the floor back over to Tom so that they can move on. But I think certainly today's conversation has highlighted that there is certainly a lot of work to be done as allies, much to discuss, and a lot of room collectively that we can think more creatively about these problems in the future. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. I so appreciate you joining us. And I'll turn the floor back over to Tom now.